We're now on today's daf Tzadi Aleph. Hol uksiv uminatzon. The Torah says min habehema min habokar uminatzon, and the vav of uminatzon kiman dichsiv yachdav tami. Even according to Rabbi Yonasan, who usually only combines the requirement of both when it says yachdav, but if it says u with the vav of and, indicating that you might think, at least, that you need both, even according to Rabbi Yonasan, even in the absence of the word yachta. So therefore, for example, in the case that we mentioned earlier, where the Torah says ish ishak shayikalas aviv ve'es imo, even Rabbi Yonasan is going to need a special pasuk to derive that you would be chayav for kilas aviv or imo because of the pasuk vav u. Now the Gemara asks the following question: Of Oshia Diomer Afal Gavtel Ksiv Yachtov Kimad Ksiv Yachtov Domi Liboy Kra. Rav Yoshia, who holds all over Shas against Rav Yonasan, that even in the absence of the word Yachtov, we derive, or shall we say, we assume, unless we know otherwise, that you require both A plus B. And therefore, here, in the case where he took a neder to bring a carbon ola, liboy kra, we should require a pasuk to derive the conclusion that he doesn't have to bring both mina bakar and minatzon, but one or the other suffices. And the Gemara answers haksiv. That's why it says in the pasuk, im ola karbano min ha bakar. And afterwards, the Torah says, "V'im min hatzon korbanos." So the fact that the Torah separates it and says, well, it could be an ola, min habakar, it could be min hatzon. The Torah is indicating that you have the choice to bring either min habakar or min hatzon. You don't have to bring both. V'idach. And according to Rabbi Yonasan, why did the Torah have to go ahead and say, im ola karbano min habakar, v'im min hatzon karbano? It would seem to be that it's unnecessary. And Rabbi Yonasan already has derived from the pasuk of mina baka o minatzon that it's one or the other. So the Gemara says it's. I still would have a havamina that you have to bring two. And why? Salta daitamina hani milu b'mefarish. When did the Torah say that you bring im ola karbono min habakar or im minatzon karbono? You have a choice of one or the other. That's only because he explicitly took a neder b'mefarash, and he said, "I will bring a carbon ola from bakar. I will bring a carbon ola from tzon." Aval b'stom, if he didn't specify Laise mitravayu, he would have to bring both. Kamash malon. Therefore, I need our pasuk in the parsha of Nesachim to teach us that in all cases he brings one single animal and he chooses either min habakar or min hatzon. Omar, let's go back to the beginning of the brisa. Toda minayin tamalomar o zevach. Frek the Gemara, I don't need O as a ribui for Toda, Otu Toda Lav Zevachu. I mean, the Torah opened up the Parsha of Nesachim with the general category called Zevach. I mean, clearly a Toda is within the category of Zevach. Itzrich. I need the O. Why is that? Since a carbon toda is accompanied by 40 lechamim, lo tiboy nisachim, whatever function the Torah had in mind by accompanying the carbon with nisachim is fulfilled in the case of lechamim. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Umayshno me'el nazir. In the case of el nazir, is the Ika Bahadei Lechem Uboy Nisachim, even though the ram that's brought by the Nazir when he completes his Nazirus is accompanied by lechamim, and that is um, the lachme el Nazir that are indicated in Parshas Naso in Bamidbar Perek Vav. So therefore, why would you assume that carbon toda is different than a carbon el Nazir? El Nazir should already be the paradigmic case of a carbon that's accompanied by lechamim, and yet it requires nisachim. Salka, I would have thought that El Nazir has one up it on Lachme Toda, as we'll soon see. And because that one up it, that's that Lachamim of the Nazir are so all in, all encompassing that it substitutes for the Sachit. I'm sorry, just the opposite. I'm sorry, I got it. Lachme Toda have one up it on Lachme Nazir. Why? Chasam, in the case of a Nazir, Shnei Minim. There's no such thing as a third category, meaning in the case of Toda, there are three categories. There's the let's just get it straight by now. I should have it. The Torah says you have to have Talos, Rekikin, and Rechuva. But in the case of Nazir, all you need is Chalos and Rekikim. You don't need Revuchos. But Hochar Ba minim, I forgot to mention the Chametz, right? You need, right? Let's go over it again. In Lachme Toda, you have 10 chametz and 30 matzah. The 30 matzah divide up into three categories, which is called chala, rikikin, and revucha. And then you have another 10, which are chametz. So you have four different categories. So maybe in that case, we would entertain the possibility that you don't need nisachim. Even though in Nazir you do need nisachim, but that's because Nazir only has two categories of lacham. Kamash Malon, therefore the Torah has to tell me that even a carbon toda, by virtue of the extra O zevach, requires nesachim. Now the Gemara asks the following question. V'lichtov rachmana lefale neder o binidava. Why did the Torah have to bother mentioning an ola? Since you're telling me that any carbon that comes binidava requires nesachim, and that derived from the pasuk lefale neder o binidava, then by definition, an ola fits that description, and therefore it would require nesachim. Why did the Torah have to emphasize ola? And the answer is going to be, if you don't mind, I'm just foreseeing, this is helping me to make sure that I know what's going on here, just to jump ahead of myself a little bit, that an ola could be similar to Bechor Maser Pesach, as opposed to Chatas V'Yosham, and therefore we need another mute to exclude Pesach, Bechor, and Maser. So in other words, we're going to need two miutim. We're going to need one miut to exclude Chatos and Osham, because those are Karbonos that are Baal Chait, and since they're Baal Chait, therefore there's no Nesachim to accompany them. And then we have Bechor, Maser, and Pesach, which are not have nothing to do with Chait whatsoever. And we're going to have to exclude them because they're not similar to Ola in the fact that Ola is Bob and Adava, and these three cannot come in Adava. Okay, so let's see it inside. Elo kos Rachmana Ola had the Torah omitted Ola Hava, I would have said Vasisem Isha Lashem Klal. Right, the opening pasuk, Vasisem Isha means anything that goes on the altar on the Aish, and that's a Klal. Lefale Neder Minadova Prat, and then Lasos Reach Nichol Chazav Kol Klal Pratu Klal Iatadona Lekena Prat Ma Prat, which is Neder Onidova. Is davar sheneba alachet, right? It's something that's lachatos oshem that's balachet can never come in davar. Afkol she'ein ba alachet otzi chatos uvi oshem she'ein ba in alachet. So I would compare. In other words, the question is, how do you describe lefale neder o benedava? Right now, the Gemara is describing it as something that you bring that has nothing to do with chait. Not sure why the Gemara has to say that, but let's go on. Is therefore Avi Bechor Umasu Pesach Bar Malachet. In other words, your prat uklal, your klal prat uklal, meaning the prat in the middle, comes to exclude something that's coming from chait, but Bechor, Maser, and Pesach have nothing to do with chait, so therefore they should be included in the requirement of accompanying it with nesachim. Tamulomar Ola. And Ola is something that's ba b'nedava, but Bechar, Maser, and Pesach can never come b'nedava. So even though they have nothing to do with Chet, the Machayev of the Korban in these three cases is nothing to do with Chet, but nevertheless, it's lacking the condition of ba b'nedava. The Gemara asks, Hashad Chsiv Ola, Klal Uprat Ma Rabisbe. Wait a second. Now you're telling me that Ola excludes anything that's not ba b'nedava through the principle of klal pratu klal. So therefore you excluded Bechar Maser Pesach. By the same token, let's exclude Chatos and Ola. Why do you need a special mute through the klal pratu klal to exclude Chatos and Osham? Chatos and Osham should be excluded from the word Ola. So Gemara answers, Ma prat mefurish eno mechuyevi omed. Afkol she'ena mechuyev omed lahaviv lados kodshim tumurasam v'ola bomen ha-mosros v'yashim shenikak le-re'iyah v'chol ha-zvachim shenizku shelo lishman. So now I'm going to take put my neck on the line. Just we'll double check that I'm correct in a second. But what we're saying now is that the klal pratu klal is coming as a ribui rather than a mute. Let's see if I'm correct. Just double check this. Just 1 second. Yeah, I think I'm correct. So the ribui now, through the prat of Ola, now let's keep in mind that you can have a carbon that requires nesachim that's female, and therefore could have a vlad, and that would be shlomim, because shlomim is even in a keva. So if you took upon yourself to bring a carbon shlomim, which you could bring from a female, and now that carbon shlomim gave birth, the question is whether the offspring requires nesachim. So that's number one. And it's described here in the Gemara as Eno Mechuya vi Omed, meaning his original vow did not really include, at least it didn't specify the Vlad, because the Vlad wasn't born yet. That's now we're on to number two. Tmurasam. Tmurasam means if you took a behemoth chulin and you pointed to it and said, this is Tmura that, and now the Torah says you violated a law, but the Tmura itself has to be brought in a carbon on the Mizbeach. So let's say you have a Tmura of a Shlomim, then that Tmura, when it's brought on the Mizbeach, and it's not donated, right, in the typical way, and yet it requires Nisachim. Okay, I wish he would spell it out here, which he doesn't, but I'm assuming that's correct. Next, we have Ola Habamina Mosros. So we had all sorts of cases of Mosros, if you remember, where, let's say, he poured it into the kli, the oil, and there was excess oil over the brim and so forth and so on. So those are called Mosros. And that led us to the concept of Ketz HaMizbeach, that if the Mizbeach has no karbonos, then we take the Mosros and we sell them, and with the money we buy a carbon ola to keep the Mizbeach busy and not idle, so to speak. And that carbon also is a kind of Eino Mechuyev V'Omed, and yet it requires Nisachim. And then we have two more categories. We have Osham Shenitak L'Re'iyah, where the Bala carbon of the Osham died, or they brought a different carbon as an atonement. So in the case of a chatas, it's mesu baleh. It's one of the five halach l'moshe misina categories that it dies. But in the case of an osham, the animal has to become a balmum. So it's given over to a roer with an iron to be brought out to the field and graze until it swallows a screw and becomes a balmum. And finally, zvachim shenizku shlo l'shmon, with halacha is that kosher, but eina ola l'bayil l'shem chova, so it's not really a carbon chova, and it's eina mechuyev v'omed in that sense, but it becomes a carbon nedava, and it requires nisachim. I'm going to read to you one line just to convince myself that what I said is correct. The generalizations extend the Nesachim requirement to any offerings similar to those of the Prat, which are Bab and Dava, and that's the Vlados and the Tmura and the Mosros, etc., etc. Weiter. V'hashta diamrit o lidrasha is lefali neder o b'nidava lomali lechalkam. Why do we have the word o to separate between neder and nidava? And this I found fascinating. Itzrich. I would have thought salka daitach. I mean, the ad de maisi neder unidava loli boy nisachim. Right, a neder is when you say harei alai. Nidava is when you say harei zu. And until he brings both a neder and a nedava, he doesn't require nisachim. Kamash V'landi, I see neder l'chude l'boy nisachim, vi I see nedav l'chude l'ai see nisachim. If he brings a neder, he has to bring nisachim. If he brings a nedava, he has to bring nisachim. I've said it a million times. I'll just say it one more time. The halachas here are very rigorous. They are very legalistic. They don't always make sense logically. I mean, why would you say that you only need nesachim if you bring both a neder and a dava? But it has to do with the structure of kudshim. Yeah. Hanichel Rabbi Oshia. Right, Rabbi Oshia is the one who says that you always assume you need both unless you know otherwise. And therefore, I would assume, if not for the word "o," that it's got to be neder and nedava, and therefore I need the word "o." But El Rabbi Yonasan, who says as a general rule, unless it says yachtav, we assume it's either or. So why would there be a havamina that you're only going to bring nesachim if you have both a neder and a nedava? I see neder l'chudei boy nesachim. I might think that if you took upon yourself a neder and you said harei olai, then you bring nesachim. I see nedava l'chudei liboy nesachim. Or if alternatively you took harei zu, but I see neder unedava. Maybe since you're bringing two karbanos, is tiskei nesachim dechad. Maybe just bring one niskei ayayin, whatever is revius ayin, whatever it is. If it's a bull, if it's a lamb, and so forth. And therefore one nesachim should be chal for both. Kamash malon. Now, I have a feeling, again, I don't know how to prove this, that what he's talking about when he says I see neder unedava, it means that he was magdish two behemoths. Now he looked at two behemoths, one was a neder, one was a dava, and he was magdish them both. And therefore, the Havmina was that they sort of integrate into one Maisa Krova, and we'll see this later on, and therefore one Nisachim would be sufficient, and therefore we need the Pasuk O. Obo an Dechem Lomani. Salkedat Kamina Hani Mili Dekam Maisi Ola Ben Neder Ushlamim Ben Dava. Now we have another Havmina, which really has nothing to do with Moadim, but if there's a ribui of O in the Moadim, then I shouldn't say a ribui, I should say a miut, right? A miut of O. And what is a kamila fuke? If, let's say, he brings Aval Heichadekam Maisi Ola Ushlamim Beneder. If he brings two different karbanos, but both are a neder, or inami olo shlam benedava, they both are a nedava. Is shem neder echad the shem nedava achas? Maybe the shem neder or the shem nedava would combine them, be mitzarif them together, such that one nesach would be enough. Tizkei lubin esachim dechan kamashman o b'moadechem. But now we have to ask another question. V'chi taseh ben bakar ola o zevach. Once again, we have the word o, lamali. Itzrich salke, I would have thought, hani mili hecha dekam maisi ola ushlamim benedenter, or ola ushlamim benedava. But what happens, hecha dekam maisi shte olos, where they're both the same carbon? Again, you don't have the commonality of both being a neder, or chada benedava. One is an ola of a neder, and the other is an ola of a nedava, but they're both olos. Inami shnei shlamim, echad neder, echad nedava, but they're both shlamim. Is ema salkedait kamina? I would have said shem shlamim achas shem ola achas. That's going to be the cementing factor. V'tizkei livin esachim achas kamash malon. Therefore, I need the o, ola o zeva. Frek to Gemara. Lefali neder o shlomim. Why do we need the o again in this pasuk? Sal kedait chamina hani mili hechdem I see shtei olos, chada beneder, v'chada benedava. Inam mishnei shlom chada beneder. Aval hechdem kamaisi shtei olos. Beneder. So now we have two factors to combine them. Number one, they're both olos, and number two, they're both nidarim. Or inami shnei shlomim beneder, right? So you have ushnei shlomim benedava. So you have two shlomim that are both in neder, or two shlomim that are both in nedava. So you have a double cementing similarity to combine them. Rabbi Yoshia Hai min aboko min atzon lomali. Right, Rabbi Yoshia says that you use the phrase to exclude olas ha'of, but what do you do with the or? The o, right, which is in English or. Oh, so Rabbi Oshia wanted to teach you that you don't have to bring for your vow of ola to bring both minatzon uminabokar. Salkadat kamina hani mili betray mili, trey mini. Al bechad mina tizkelu b'nesachim v'chad. Right, so you might want to bring the same species of animals on two for two korbanos and one nisachim. So now the shem behema would combine them in the two kamash malon. Kochetasu liechad lomoli salkedat kaminahani mili bozachar zeh. Aval v'vasach. This is what I was indicating before, that if he was magdish both animals for two different korbanos at the same time, tizkilu b'nisachim dechad kamash malon. Now the Mishnah says, right, these are the only exceptions to the rule that generally says with chatos and enoshim are not accompanied by nisachim. Is minani mili. Tana Rabbana, we learned in the Brisa, ushlosha esronim. We're quoting a pasuk now in Vayichi Yudalid, soles mincha. The mincha b'ma zevach hakosu medaber. So we're talking about a korban mincha that accompanies a korban, which is called nesachim. Like, for example, in the case of a mitzora, which is a korban olav yored, so a wealthy mitzora brings three korbanos, chatas, osham, and ola, and he brings them all from kvasim. He brings three astronos of soles for the three kvasim. So you see clearly that the chatas and the osham and the mitzvah require mincha to be brought with them, and that doesn't apply to any other chatas or osham. Maybe in terms of the three esronos of soles, that's a mincha that the mitzvah must bring, but has nothing to do with the karbanos, and therefore it's like an ordinary mincha, and the kovetz is burnt on the mizbeach, and the shiurayim are eaten by the kohen. But it's not talking about minchas nesachim, which is completely burnt on the mizbeach. Kshu omer vehela kohen es ha'ola v'es ha'mincha. Hevi omer b'mincha boy mazevach hakosu medaber. Right? It says that he's bringing the ola and the mincha. It means that the mincha is coming to accompany the ola. So it's not a mincha bo b'fnei atzma. V'adayin eni yodea im te'unin esachim b'lav. And how do I know that in such a case that the mincha will accompany the ola Then you require Nesachim. Talmud Lomer v'yayin l'nesach revius hahin tasa al ha'ola o l'zevach l'keves ha'echad. So how do we derive it from this pasuk? Ola zu olas mitzora, zevach zu chatos mitzora, o l'zevach zu asham mitzora. So these are the three korbanos that a mitzora brings at the end of his purification. He brings an ola, a chatos, and an asham. And all three of these karbanos of the mitzvah require yayin nesach to accompany them. Frekting gemara v'tepuk le travayu mi zevach. Right? Why do you only? In other words, the chatas and the asham are both called zevach. So once the Torah says zevach, why do you need the extra word o for the asham? If the word zevach is referring to a chatos, then the asham should be included together with the chatos. And you don't need the extra word o.